Thank you. Apologies for this late start. We had some technical difficulties, as you can see. And so, hello and welcome to this session. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying while we faced all these difficulties. But welcome to the session on contextualizing AI with cross-cultural perspectives. I am Suneepa Dev, and this is Aida Davani. We are both researchers at Google Research in the Responsible AI and Human-Centered Technologies organization in a team called Technology, AI, Society, and Culture, or the TASK team. Today, we are very excited to share some of our work and the insights we've learned along the way about growing tools, pipeline systems in AI in a way that is socioculturally aware and inclusive globally. So we will first talk about cultural representation in AI generations that we see and the training systems themselves, and how a lack of diversity in the pipeline can have a lot of wide-ranging impacts. We will discuss some strategies that we have adopted for incorporating cultural variations into model training and evaluations. We specifically walk through 3 scenarios, each about a specific touchpoint of culture and generative AI development. First, we talk about cultural differences that lead to annotator subjectivity in an evaluation task. It talks about how differences in experiences lead to varied annotations, which are not just disagreements, but actually something more foundationally different, which needs to be accounted for and incorporated into the pipelines rather than seen as something to be resolved using an average or a maximum number of annotations for a case or something. We then take the learnings from this specific case to a case study where we talk about how we can use these diverse perspectives in terms of annotator pools and annotations to build a more robust and diverse evaluation resource for different cases. And finally, we discuss pathways to cultural inclusion with more community-engaged methods, and we contrast these different approaches. Sorry. Sorry. And then we contrast all of these different pathways that we've adopted, and we just talk through some of these different strategies. We'll also open up to more discussion on each of these and try to see what strategies you prefer or you have used or what you think could work. We will have discussion points in between and at the end, but we would love for feedback and discussion to be there throughout. Before we go into more details, it's important to note that there might be some text, specifically some stereotypical statements that could be offensive. So please do take a moment if needed. And feel free to ask questions, stop us for feedback, comments, anything throughout. We hope that this would be much more discussion-based, and we've loosely structured this session. So with this, I'll hand it over to Aida.
Thanks, Suneepa. So the recent advancement in the generative AI developments have led to the release of multiple varying models that varied in their increasing size, their complexity, their modality, and their advertised capabilities. These models can now be accessed and used with no prior knowledge about how to work with machine learning, and they are being used for many usual tasks such as writing, creating art, helping with everyday tasks like travel planning and coursework, and etc. And while these technologies can work well for some groups, history has told us that technologies don't always work the same way for different populations. As you might remember, and as is shown in these headlines, image search and other retrieval tools have suffered from gender and racial biases. So the emerging generative technologies will also raise similar concerns and even new ones. And if we want to launch them globally, we need to consider and ensure that these technologies work well for a diverse set of stakeholders. And to do that, we need to understand how different communities and cultures are being affected and impacted by these technologies. So as researchers on generative AI, we have been exploring and experimenting with representations of cultures in different scenarios and use cases of these models. As an example, imagine using an LLM to get inspirations for a story, writing a story that is taking place in a city that you haven't visited. These are two examples that BART has generated for Paris and Accra. We want to know if you see any differences in the themes and in the keywords that are being used to describe this story. So while the story about Paris is like a setting for art and paintings and artists flourishing, the Accra story is about impoverished children being rescued. And these two stories, if these kinds of themes show up repeatedly, then our technologies are just adding to the stereotype and the tropes that we've seen in the media. The same happens if we generate such studies with another model, with ChatGPT. And in these examples, actually, we don't see any variation of the representation of the cities. And in fact, what we can see here is a lack and erasure of any cultural rich content and any uniqueness or differences of the cities that we might be interested in. And the representations are just erased to have similar presentation of the two cities. This lack of cultural variety becomes more noticeable when generative models are asked to demonstrate global concepts. For example, in a text-to-image generation illustration, when we ask for different cultural concepts, most of the results that we get can be most Western-centered. So in this example, we asked for representations of festivals, and the resulting images only show the concept in a limited Western setting. And many different festivals around the world and in different cultures are being erased from these representations. These are some examples that could have been in this the representation of festivals. Similarly, illustrations of traditions and concepts that are related to universal traditions that happen around the world can cover a very limited set of settings and tend to be mostly Western oriented. So this image is about wedding and doesn't include the wedding practice and practices across the different cultures, religions, and nations. And these differences are erased. So we have some similar work from our team that speaks about these issues in T2I models at the values and representation session later today. If you want to attend it, it's the paper on AI regimes of representation. Let's just turn around, see if you have some experiences with these kinds of erasure or misrepresentation of culture that you have seen in experiments with the LLMs and you want to share. Just take a couple of minutes and think about examples.
It doesn't have to be LLMs. It can be any generative model that you have used in the near past.
So Iranian girls with no face. Search Iranian school children
Interesting. I didn't know that.
So if you search Iranian school girls, typically the image that you get is a bunch of girls with their back towards, it's not the camera, but where the perspective is. Say that again.
The
So,
third time is the
I
best.
think now they have changed the model, and if you search that, you will get something else. But Iranian schoolgirl, when I search, when you do it a number of times, if you do Canadian, so I'm Iranian Canadian. If you search Canadian, there are girls that are laughing and smiling together. Iranian schoolgirls are typically girls with a scarf and everything, and it's their face is not showing. They have their back towards where the viewer would be. So that's the erasure of their face or their happiness, and they look sad, obviously.
Thank you.
Anybody? Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Pranav. I'm from Penn State University. So we had done a work which focused on GPT-2, which is a more older model at this point. But what we found out was countries which were from like lower income groups or which had lesser representation on the internet tend to have way more toxic content produced by models such as GPT-2 and 3, as compared to like news articles that were actually shown or taken from like local sources from that said country, or incidents that even talked about that said country. The representation from actual news to what these models generated were very hateful, negative, toxic. So yeah, I think it's more on like misalignment of representation on the internet, which kind of comes through these models as well.
Yeah, some perpetuation of the bias that is already in the media about those countries.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Chen. I'm a student at UCSD, and I was hosting a workshop on subverting professionalism. So Canva has like a thing where you can like do like a magic eraser and you highlight what you want to change, and then you specify using like natural language, and you can highlight like your hair and say like give me like professional hair, assuming that like the subversion there is like for like dyed hair or something like that, and it had a tendency to give people like blonde hair, or when it didn't know what to do, it would just take like clip art of like a professional like stock photo and like put it on people instead of like actually whatever that like norm is.
That's a very interesting case study.
Hi, I'm Selim with Google DeepMind and University of Vienna. This was for Stable Diffusion. If you put a person in front of their villa or single-family home, for the US it put the most lush homes, and for I don't even know which country, for a country in Africa, just put a really big house that still looked really run down. Yeah.
The same representation of poverty in Africa.
Yeah, these are all like really great points. Thanks for sharing it.
Go ahead.
One more. So I'm Stephen Wu from UT Health, and also from a nonprofit in North Africa. And we looked at ChatGPT and asked it to generate some code. And it gave, we did it in English and in Arabic. And in English, gave like really precise, like, here's what you need to do, here's how to use it, here's like detailed code. And in Arabic, it gave like the exact same question, well, translated, of course. And it gave kind of like working code, but then maybe less filled in, and then at the end it was like, and this is just a starter, and like, you know, you can take it more from there, and stuff like that. So it was interesting. You know, it was not like a tested or you know, repeatable kind of thing, but it was interesting that we did feel like the Arabic coders tend to say that kind of thing at the end of statements pretty often. Interesting.
Fascinating. Yeah, thank you for sharing these examples. And they all show like some kind of like both like cultural differences, but also not considering these differences when training the data or like the models, or even reporting on how these are being considered. So the previous research have shown that this one-dimensional approach for representation of people is baked across different layers of our systems, and which results into this unchecked cultural erasure. There's evidence, for example, that traces back these biases back into the training data. For example, in one research on the common crowd corpus, which is like used in in training many language models, the training data is mostly scraped from Western websites, and like most of the language is in English. And this is not exclusive to language data. For example, as research on public image data sets have shown, for example, the ImageNet data set, 1/3 of the geographically identifiable images in that data set are sampled from the US, and in fact, like 60% of the whole data set is only represents 6 Western countries. Data annotation similarly falls short when it comes to representing opinions from individuals or coders from various backgrounds, cultures, and nationalities. So previous studies with mTurkers shows that their locations has an imbalanced distribution over the world, and but it is not clear how much this lack of cultural representation limits the various annotated data sets and the benchmarks that are coming out of them and the ML models that are being trained or evaluated on them. Even benchmarks that are explicitly designed with the goal of debiasing these models from social biases lack representation of different social groups and nationalities across the world. So this figure shows the total distribution of all the nationalities that are included in a set of several benchmarks for a stereotype content. And as you can see, like the global south does not have that much representation in these data sets. So all this evidence have motivated a body of work and research on including more representative universal knowledge into the ML training and evaluation pipelines. Here, we will walk you through 3 approaches that we have adopted for enriching evaluation processes by collecting culturally diverse data. And so for the first research, we get into the evidence for the cultural varieties that lead to subjective perspectives in annotation, especially for safety annotation tasks. So the task of safety filtering for generative models and large language models rely on human annotated benchmarks and to prevent the models from creating offensive language. And a growing body of research on model safety argue that the high annotator disagreement in these tasks is not just exclusively noisy data, and they call against majority voting for aggregating annotations into ground truth labels that are then used as benchmarks. So motivated by this evidence, we investigated the impact of cultural differences on the subjectivity of annotators across different regions and countries. So we collected annotations from 4,000 annotators from 21 countries across 8 geocultural regions. And we have each item in our data set annotated by at least 3 annotators from each region. So we focused on each region and used the same practice of creating the majority vote. As a result, we could have like 8 different benchmarks or data sets by relying on annotators from each region. So when we explored the differences between these benchmarks, we found that there are a large number of items that could have been annotated as either offensive or not if we focus in a specific region. So here you can see two such examples. Some of them might have like more culturally offensive language. Some of them have keywords that annotators from some regions did not know about, and this leads to like having these different levels of offensiveness. This led us to analyzing the regional differences in the annotations, and our results shows that there are significant differences between these 8 different regions. And in fact, annotators from the Arab culture and Latin America, for example, reported the highest level of offensiveness on the same items, and annotators from Sinosphere and Oceania were providing the least level of offensiveness. We also zoomed into different countries in each region and compared the different countries, and we found cases where responses from one country was significantly different from the others. So for example, participants from China in many cases reported the least level of offensiveness for the items, and digging into why data collection has led to such various results and why one country has like so much different reported offensiveness scores can teach us a lot about how we are using these, creating these benchmarks and using them. So we asked what cultural dimensions we can consider that are shaping these various perspectives. As one of these cultural variables, we explored the weirdness of the countries. So weirdness is like a score for how similar the country is considered culturally to the US. So when we compared the weirdness score of the countries, the results show that the countries that were more similar culturally to the US were reporting lower levels of offensiveness on the same items. And we also asked if these cultural differences are rooted into some moral values and norms that are different across different regions and different cultures, and if this is like somehow like explaining the disagreement. So we considered a specific framework for assessing moral concerns that explains moral concerns based on 6 moral foundations. And our analysis showed that the cultural differences in the moral values are in fact mediating the effect that we were seeing in the geocultural differences of annotations. So annotators' cultural differences is one important factor for these that is impacting the safety evaluation benchmarks, and it's important to ask what it means for our data collection efforts and how we can gather more culturally representative set of responses. So with that, I wanted to also ask, have this open discussion if you know of any ML tasks that tend to be more subjective, and if there is evidence about annotators or different understandings of language or data that can lead to different results that might be more cultural.
I see 2 hands raised.
So I think I've seen before in annotation of faces, the attempt to annotate emotions is pretty cultural, and also especially smiles specifically as an indication of happiness, when in a lot of cultures smiling in photos is not a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Also kind of differences in whether something is considered relevant or no. So in annotation task, describe the person. Some groups will immediately also describe the sex, and other groups won't do that. They'll just describe what the person's doing. So it's kind of salience of things, I guess.
Yeah. If there.
I think there's one more. Yeah.
Thank you. One thing we observed in image to text annotations was actually the brevity of the descriptions. So I think one thing we, in one of the projects we noticed was that for more Western annotators, they actually tended to bias their text descriptions towards being more brief and more about the main subject of whatever is in the image, versus annotators from other cultures tend to describe the entire component of the image, the setting, various other aspects as well.
Yeah, thank you. These are very interesting cultural differences that we can't even handle on the annotation setting, let alone creating benchmarks for them and evaluating them in the models. There's another answer there, if you.
I have more of a question, and apologies if this comes up later. But how do you discretize the word into these cultures, right? We struggle a lot with that, and I understand no solution is satisfactory. but sometimes I need to do research, so I need to find something.
Yeah, definitely. Like because you have.
How do you do this?
Yeah, so there are like you can like there is no mapping between like even countries and cultures or regions and cultures. We use like a UN specified like grouping. I can like share it with you if you want. Like you can refer to that. Yeah. Okay, with that I pass it that to Sonny.
No, this was great. I think this was a great segue. Yeah, we face very similar challenges about how do we define it and how do we really find a proxy. And like you said, we find some proxies in nationalities and UN mappings, but they of course can be made more granular and better, and more work needs to go into that. But yeah, with this, let me see. Yes. Yeah, so with these learnings about how annotations are so socially situated themselves, we are going to take these learnings and try to use it on a socioculturally representative annotation work, which will help us grow our evaluation resources in language modeling. So we do this in this case for the specific task of stereotyping harm or measurement of stereotyping harm, which again we know is very socially situated. So stereotypes are very different and when perceived across nationalities, across regions, and they live very differently in different cultures. And we go back to this plot that Ida had shared before. While we have these growing models, our measurements are not scaled as often. For stereotyping in language models, the datasets and resources we use are very limited in size and also represent only a handful of nations and their cultures. A lot of work focuses on stereotypes as seen in the West and specifically North America. And in this plot, as we see, which covers different commonly used resources, the number of stereotypes known globally and the coverage of the globe overall is very low, with sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America in particular having barely any representation. We attempt to expand this coverage in this particular project by leveraging generative abilities of language models themselves, and then coupling them with carefully distributed annotations, which render local lens and local knowledge into these data sets. So let's answer the question of why language models for this, right? The reason is that if we imagine the universal set of stereotypes as seen in this Venn diagram as the union of these two sets, language models can be thought of as a window into society itself, and that they are trained on a vast amount of textual data, learn a lot of social information, and are able to capture and generate a substantial fraction of these stereotypes. Not all generations that they make are, of course, stereotypes. They can be noise, they can be spurious correlations, other generations, and so on, which is why they need to have contextually situated human validations to understand which of these or what of these statements is a stereotype. So we use this knowledge to develop a broad coverage benchmark by using existing resources, like let's say UNESCO data or other NLP benchmarks as seeds that we feed into our models in a few shot prompting setting. So let's say we have a model like PaLM or GPT-3. We feed these known stereotypes into the models and ask it to generate similar stereotypes or similar associations, and they actually generate a large volume of such associations. What this does, in fact, really well is that it expands the number of identities we see. So if we limit ourselves to like a group of researchers sitting together or even a smaller population like generating a set of stereotypes, the identities we know, the stereotypes we know are limited. And usually it's directed by the limited world knowledge of the researchers themselves, whereas this actually generates a large volume. Now, of course, not all of it will be meaningful, which is why we use distributed annotations on top of this to find out what are stereotypes and what are not. So this step of annotations, is this slide clear? Because on my screen, it's not very bright. But what we do is we distribute our annotations globally. And in particular, one of the kind of annotations we got for this study was to get for each association to get annotations from individuals identifying with the region and living in it. So for example, let's say we have associations about Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, India. We find annotators who identify as South Asian and are living in South Asia, and we get them to annotate them. Similarly, we do it for Latin America, for Australia, and so on. We also do some other contrasting kinds of coverage, which I will point to the paper in the next slide, I think. So if you want to read up more about the contrasting annotations, please do go read that. But with this, what we do is we are able to get nuances of how stereotypes are very socially situated. And we also avoid Western gaze about whether a stereotype exists in society or not. So this gives us a lot of advantages. The first being the greater coverage that we have. We have over 10 times the identities covered as compared to any other benchmark, or like all benchmarks together. And as we see here, it's not just scaling up in number, but also scaling out in terms of who is covered by this benchmark. We have greater coverage of sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, and even Australia, which was surprisingly missing in a lot of these other benchmarks. But why is this important? What we have seen is, with this resource, when we try to evaluate models on if they are generating these stereotypes, we see that emphatically they are. So it is important to have greater coverage and to bring more perspectives and more identities into our evaluation pipelines. So with this, I'll again turn it around to ask about if there are evaluations that you have used or that you know of where this limitation persists. I think we've already touched upon it a little bit with the toxicity that you mentioned, Pranav, about how it's missing perspectives of toxic language in cultures beyond the US or beyond the West, and how language is not accounted for. But if there are any others, or even if you want to talk more about that.
Hi, I guess I have a sort of a general question about this discussion point and maybe some others, which is the issue of selection bias, right? Especially as you go across the world, there's going to be, but even let's say in the Western countries, right, there's going to be a certain selection for subpopulations whenever you sample. For example, rural will be systematically underrepresented, and that tends to be fairly different subcultures than urban subcultures. And perhaps for other areas, let's say, I mean, I can speak a little bit more comfortably about Russia. The kinds of people you'll tend to get from there are people who are already strongly Western influenced, and perhaps Western influenced to the more extreme than people living in the West. So it seems like pretty much any time that you try to get cross-cultural representation, you're going to get a certain amount of selection bias and actually potentially skewed results across cultures too.
That's a great point, actually, and absolutely, we do resonate with that. But the hope is that as we keep doing more work, we will get to that granular level where it's not just the people who've been influenced to a certain extreme or like a certain culture who'll only be responding. And actually, so the next point that we'll go to, it's about a way which does a more community-engaged effort of collecting all of this. So we actually try to interact with different communities to get what identities they think are salient, what disparities they think are salient in their region, in their culture, and try to capture that. Even the one that we actually discussed today will be limited to some extent, but we can see how iteratively, as we try to engage more and more, we will have a more representative resource as opposed to the kind of limited or narrowly scoped resources that we currently validate our models using. I don't know, I mean, yeah, does that sort of... We see two hands, yes.
Thanks. Hello, Jim from University of Washington. So one of the students I'm working with right now is actually exploring the idea of like biases in tasks involving language models and image generation and image to text. And one of the challenges we've been facing is this entanglement of language itself with culture. So for example, one of the things that we're looking at is, for example, image to text. We will see biases in kind of the generated labels, and as you've shown in the examples before in the generative models as well. But a question that we've been asking is, for example, do we see the same for a language model that's generating, for example, in Chinese or in French versus in English? And one of the challenges in evaluation today is actually a lot of the evaluation still focuses on like having culture but not situated in the original language. So we are evaluating aspects of culture in a large language model in English when maybe it is not, or maybe that bias is correctly representing that bias in like the English speaking space. And if we ask the same question in the original language, it will not show this issue. And so one challenge that we've been facing is like, how do we actually do this, right? How can we actually try to disentangle culture from like language in this language-based models, evaluation of language-based models?
That is a great question. I'll try to answer one part of it, and maybe Ida, if you wanted. So, yeah, disentanglement of language and culture, I wouldn't try to speak to that, but I will say that with this work that we just discussed, we are trying to, the back button is, yes. We are trying to actually do it multilingually as well now. So the issue, like you said, that you rightfully pointed out, that there is such limited resources in languages beyond English that it's very hard to even attempt to start to build an evaluation pipeline. The models are lacking, the resources are lacking, but with this, we were able to expand it to multilingual because we now have some stereotypes for a specific region, which we can potentially see reflected in that language itself to some extent, and then use multilingual models in a similar way to try and get a larger resource for that space. That is, of course, one aspect of it. The other aspect is to actually engage with communities in those spaces and try and understand what are the identities that we should be looking at, what are the disparities we should be looking at, because it's very likely that even these are from a more of a Western perspective and that we are rendering a Western gaze still, because the data eventually is trained on a lot of Western websites. So yeah, that's a very challenging problem, and it's something that we are trying to tackle piecewise, if that makes sense. Do you want to add something?
Based on that question, I had like a small anecdote while we were performing a study involving language that's used in like the community based on people with disability. This is beyond culture. I've seen like for simple tasks such as even sentiment analysis, where you need to like measure something that's just basically positive or negative. Just because a model doesn't understand the kind of language that's used in a specific community, like in our example, it was people with disability, it tended to skew it very negative just because there are new words or just new terms that just come into play, even though the context is very positive, very encouraging even. But the overall sentence for just these simple tasks are almost always negative, just because like the training data set or even the understanding of including other communities in your annotations or your training data set is just not there. So it's easy for a model to just associate something that's not there to being something that is negative or something that's harmful even. So that's just a small anecdote that we had during our experiment.
I want to bring up another issue. I work in Spain. Our annotation budgets are typically, if we are lucky, we are working with an annotation budget of $2,000 for our paper, but most of our projects with PhD students have annotation budgets in the order of $400 per paper or something like that. So it's really challenging for us to find like budget-conscious ways of checking for these biases, and I would love to hear your advice on that. Yes.
Do you want to take that? No, I think that's definitely a very big challenge because it also juxtaposes with data work being valued, right? Like our budgets right now for data annotation, they are limited, but is that the right thing? Like I feel like that's a bigger question that our community needs to ask, because if our models, they hinge on these data sets for evaluation, for training, then we need to value it more. We need better data, but it won't come at a lower cost. So, I mean, it's a very valid point, and I know it's a big challenge across the globe, but I think the push needs to be in the other direction, if that makes sense. Yes, let's take one last before we try to get through the material, but then yeah.
Sorry, it's actually more of a question, so we can come back to it. It's fine. It's not that relevant to probably what you're going to talk about next, so I'll raise my hand later. It's okay.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. We will pass the mic to you first at the end of the presentation. But as I guess what a lot of you said, and what I'm going to say next, is that even with all of this, with these situated annotations, we actually have not been as culturally inclusive. We haven't been able to include as many perspectives as we should, or we haven't been able to get better participation, because at the end of the day, an annotation task is still one-sided. A person can only attest to the validity of a statement, not weigh in on what is correct, what is not, what the axes of disparities are, and what we should actually be looking at. And we have the 2-minute mark? Okay, so in that case, I will power through this to just talk very briefly about a community-engaged method that we used to partner this. So what happens is, like we said, like even with this, we actually are very limited in how much perspectives and how much of conversation we're able to have, and how much of their own side people are able to tell us. And that's why we adopted a community-based collection of stereotypes for India particularly. Of course, we could have done it for any region, but given that I am from India, I had some context about the disparities, and that's why we started there. And we also had a social scientist who was locally based in India, who was working with marginalized communities, has a network of NGOs, and we collected surveys from participants in government-run or government-funded universities, because they mandate diversity in their enrollment schemes. And with that, we were able to actually gather a lot of finer-grained and intersectional identities, a lot of new and complementary stereotypes, and we were able to avert the Western gaze. So for example, Dalit women, if you see, it captures caste and gender, which actually interplay very uniquely in this setting and would actually not be there in any other resource if we don't specifically go seek these out. And that is why, with the mixture of all of these different pathways that we talked about, we are trying to get more cultural inclusion in our resources so that we are able to build better models which do better in global settings. So I will stop here with this very, very fast run through of the last few slides. And do we still have a minute, or are we done? We don't, okay.
I want to thank Aida and Sumiko for a wonderful tutorial, but to be conscious of time, but I'm sure that you can find them outside and ask them all of the process.
Hi folks, come in, grab a seat. Is this it?
Are you the presenters?
Yes.
Are you doing it one at a time or kind of back and
Together.
forth? Do you
Yeah.
want to use these two items? You have your podium and then we have that.
And then is there one around the audience? Or should we...
They have it on
Okay,
a stand,
perfect.
so
That's
if you
perfect.
can ask people to go, because it's being recorded too, and
Yeah.
then everybody can hear it. Okay, thank
If
you.
you could just announce in the beginning of the presentation that if someone has a question, they can go there.
Absolutely.
That would be awesome. Also, I was doing volunteer and we're just going to the sessions to let me know if I can help.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Hey friends, I'm Alex Chodashova. I'm one of the members of the executive committee, and I'm here with Downer News. That shouldn't be surprising to anyone. On the Slack and other places, there have been people who have been reporting some COVID symptoms at the conference. And also, we know that influenza B is quite virulent right now in the Chicago area. So if this changes your calculus with respect to masking, I just wanted to provide you with that information. We know people get sick all the time. It's not like we have a huge outbreak, et cetera, but just in case this changes your masking calculus, wanted to provide you that info. And now I'll hand it off to these wonderful folks for a much more exciting tutorial.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. I'm Sorel Friedler. I am currently a computer science professor at Haverford College, and previous to this was part of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where I worked on the AI Bill of Rights, along with Mark. Say hi, Mark.
I'm Mark Adenoff. I am a researcher currently at the University of Mississippi. Will be at the Institute for Advanced Study next year, and I was a senior advisor and chief of staff at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy.
So our hope today is, first of all, that this will be an interactive session. So, I want to inject some energy into the room. So our hope is to sort of talk to you a little bit about what the AI Bill of Rights is and sort of does as a policy mechanism. But then we're also hoping that we can have sort of a rich discussion about what to do with it next, right? How it can be useful to you all in whatever efforts you are trying to do. So I wanted to start by just sort of doing the groundwork of what is this thing that we're talking about. So last October, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy released this blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, and it includes 5 principles. So these are safe and effective systems, algorithmic discrimination protections, data privacy, notice and explanation, and human alternatives consideration and fallback. And in addition to the sort of one-sentence descriptions that you'll see up here of what these principles are, in the document there's sort of a longer paragraph unpacking that attempts to be a little bit more concrete. And then there's also a technical companion, which I'll go into in a little bit more depth in a bit. I also wanted to highlight that in one of the documents that was released with the AI Bill of Rights, there's sort of this section on the right in quotes. And I think that is important because it sort of grounds the document in the experience of harms that obviously has been documented by this community and journalists and activists and so on, right? Sort of focusing on the way that, what this document is trying to do is before the older Americans died critical health benefits because of an algorithm change and so on. I'm going to pass it off to Mark.
Thank you so much. Can I give you this second mic? As you know, this is a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And one of the joys of putting out a document like this is a bunch of graphic designers that made a whole bunch of images, and they really had fun adding to our usual, zeros and ones that create, the Declaration of Independence or whatnot. But I really like the blueprint metaphor. And we thought all throughout the policy process, how will this thing be used? It's a document to be used that's guiding its inception. The proof will be in the pudding, whether it builds something incredible or whether it is another policy document. So how do we think about building policy to be used? I just want to talk a little bit about that history to give you some context of where we're coming from. First, as you know, this is a document that really grew out of this community, not kind of sort of grew out of this community. We thought in leadership how to bring people in from fact, how to make sure this community was engaged, how to rely on the insights that you all had systematized so effectively. So much of how we think about policy is how to start with values and how to let problem definition lead. So to ground where we're coming from, when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris came into office, the chief of staff sent out this memo that everything, as much as possible, would be oriented around 4 crises that we were solving. So the COVID-19 crisis, the resulting economic crisis, the climate crisis, and a racial equity crisis. Putting the racial equity crisis front and center guided how we thought about tech policy. Tech policy would be part of how we think of this first order issue. So if you think of so much of policymaking as being about prioritization. This laid out where tech policy was going to fit in first and foremost. And you see it in the personnel choices. So not only were people from the fact community brought in, but a sociologist of science and technology with a focus on racial equity, Alondra Nelson, was brought in as the deputy director and then the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy to lead this. I really want to underscore this question of problem definition in how you think about what the Bill of Rights does and what it can do. It says this messy thing called tech policy can go into certain recognizable buckets. It doesn't have to always be its own category, but this is going to be a fight with, is this a mental health policy issue? Is this a gender policy issue? How can we build alliances with these other policy areas? We drew very much from a rights tradition in the United States. So there was a question at the keynote yesterday that I wanted to pick up on. How do you choose values? How do you not sink into relativism? Our answer was to look to social movements and the history of social movements in the United States. So decades and decades of organizing to articulate and to enact certain rights. So when you hear the Bill of Rights, it's important to both think of the, encased documents that just appear, but think also of the created rights that came from social movements much more recently. So in my head, I often thought of the welfare rights movement. I think this is a really strong example because welfare rights were created a few different times in the United States by different movements. So you can think of the efforts that led into New Deal legislation to say, you have a right to a certain basic income, certain protections that were part of programs like Social Security, AFDC, what's now TANF, what led to programs like Medicare and Medicaid. That was a fight. Then in the 60s and 70s, you have the welfare rights movement that says, you actually have the right to self-knowledge. You have the right to decide and to declare and to self-attest as to your needs and to push back against really invasive caseworker invasions into your home to determine your need. So these caseworker visits were documented by the welfare rights movement. A lot of it was about checking to see if there was a man in the home. Happy to talk more about the welfare rights movement. But I think some of the efforts to systematize what it meant to get government services came out of this movement. Lastly, the welfare rights movement and language about rights were part of how the federal government enforced access to government services among a diffuse set of states. So these rights claims are a way to get federal regulation of diverse and problematically unequal state services. So how do you make, just to keep on this, how do you make a process that's used? For us, this very much meant making it a public process that relied on a wide set of democratic inputs. So we used some traditional methods and some non-traditional methods. So putting out there in a big Wired op-ed that where America needs an AI-powered, a Bill of Rights for an AI-powered world. There was a lot of good discussion yesterday in the session on public policy on responding to RFIs. I think one of the really important ones was on biometrics. We got all sorts of letters emailed in. I think, Sorel, was it like 1,000 pages of written responses from 130 orgs? So thank you, and thank you to the readers. We also worked on the assumption that we had to go to people to get their information, to not just assume that everyone had something to write in, but we actually wanted to make sure we were consciously and actively engaging with these issues. So we did panel discussions on specific areas, and so you can take a look there. And I want to talk for a minute about this slide because it's what was most important to me as chief of staff in thinking about what is successful policy. We thought a lot about how to make policy sticky. And I have a colleague who used to, as hokey as it is, hand out marshmallows to remind her colleagues to make policy sticky. What does sticky mean? It means that Political appointees like myself come and go, but regulations take a little bit longer to change. How do you empower the regulatory community at all the different agencies across all the different sectors to take up this AI Bill of Rights, to make it real, to make it concrete? The example I have in my head that I think was really helpful comes, it may come as a surprise to you, from the Windsor decision. So if you remember, the right to same-sex marriage came about in, it seemed, a Supreme Court decision in 2012. That needed to be translated into a whole set of new definitions, a new set of regulations, a new set of protections in every single agency. So I know we have a colleague here from IRS. They had to change their filing systems. We have colleagues here from EEOC. They had to start looking at different types of protections. So in the first year after that decision came out, the Attorney General sent out a memo and said, here's our progress report. And there were about 36 regulatory actions, new definitions, just in the first year. So when we think of what does success look like, one metric is that this is translated down into each and every sector, into each and every part of the federal government, way you interact with state government, that it trickles down. For the AI Bill of Rights, we're starting to see this happen already. We saw this on the launch date, so some really exciting moves to protect workers, to protect consumers, students, housing. So again, moving from these top-level principles down to sectoral practices, and complementing that with clear direction and messaging and leadership from the top that says, these are our value statements, these are our problem statements, and here's where we want to go. So I won't talk more about any of the specific agency actions, but instead turn it over to Sorel to talk about the principles.
Hi. Okay, so in addition to this sort of higher level principle statements that's sort of at the front of the document, we also wanted to be more specific, right? Sort of like recognizing that this community, me previously wearing different hats, lots of you in the room, have definitely put out previous AI ethics principles, right? There are lots of AI ethics principles. We didn't just want to put out yet another set of AI ethics principles. We wanted to figure out, what's the next set of work that needs to be done, right? What's the next sort of distillation of the work that all of us in this room have done as a community that needs to be present in a document? And so that's really what the technical companion tries to do, right? It tries to take us to that next level of concreteness, right? What are the specific actions that we want to see people taking? And there's a few things that we needed to do for that. So one key question is, what technology are we even talking about here, right? How are we going to scope this document, right? So we called it an AI Bill of Rights. Do we mean AI? How do we define AI? What work is that word doing there in the title, right? And I think, as many in this community have said, right, and critiqued, we don't really quite mean AI in a formal sense, right? We're using that to signal a wide variety of technologies, most of which are data-driven, some of which are actually quite simple, technically, right? But when they have impact on people, can still cause real harm. And so that is really how we focused this definition, is to focus on the impact on people, right? If this is some automated system that impacts people's rights, their equal opportunities, their access to critical resources or services, then it's something that we should care about. It's something that we should put extra guardrails in place to try to protect people from harm about, right? If it's something that doesn't really impact people, right? Like, I'm a computer science professor, the projects that students do in my classes aren't really going anywhere outside of my class. And that's fine, right? That's what they're meant for. And they wouldn't fall under, right, the need to have these types of extra protections in place, right? And so we thought a lot, right, about how to scope the document. In the longer document, and I'm going to go through one of the principles in a minute, just to give you an example. But what you'll see is 3 sections associated with each principle. The first one is, why is this principle important? And we wrote this document to be accessible to members of the research community, but especially to be accessible to the public and to policymakers, right, who might be introduced to these ideas for the very first time. And so part of our goal here is really to make the case for why we should be worried about harms from these systems at all, and to make it in a really accessible manner. So in the why this principle is important, we sort of take those specific concrete examples. Then there's what should be expected of automated systems. And this is really a list of those concrete safeguards that we want to see people start to implement. And then finally, how these principles can move into practice tries to give examples of places in policy where in one way or another, these are already starting to be taken seriously. So I want to go through algorithmic discrimination protections as a sort of example of what unpacking one of these principles looks like, and hopefully moves it to concreteness. So again, algorithmic discrimination protections. You should not face discrimination by algorithms and systems should be used and designed in an equitable way. And this longer paragraph, right, while still being sort of at the principles level, tries to be a little bit more specific about what that means and what we expect, right? So for example, designers, developers, and deployers of automated systems should take proactive and continuous measures to protect individuals and communities from algorithmic discrimination and to use and design systems in an equitable way, right? So then what does that mean is what we're gonna unpack next. So first, why is this principle important? Here again, we drew on research from those in this community, from journalists also, that show that, as we all know, right, that a lot of these systems across a wide variety of different demographic groups have negative impacts and negative impacts specific to different demographic groups, right? And so what we tried to do here, strategically in the document, but also to allow people to understand that this really does impact them, is make sure that we included genuinely a wide variety of groups. So this is just a selection of them, but in the document you'll see negative impacts on Black people, on women, on queer and trans folks, on Jews, and so on. Folks with disabilities. I'm sure I'm missing some other groups that we included in the document. And you'll also see that we try to point to ways that these negative impacts are happening in the financial system, in education, in employment, in healthcare, right? A lot of policy is based on sort of sector-specific approaches. And so we also wanted to signal, you know, even if you're a regulator in some specific narrow area and you think that this doesn't apply to you, here's an example that shows that it does. Next, we include different practical safeguards that can be put in place to try to prevent these harms. And again, this draws on research from this community. And in the document, each of these is sort of associated with a longer paragraph that spells out what this might be. But I like to think about this as a checklist for action. So these are steps that we want to see actually taken. So we want to see that there's proactive assessment of equity in design. This is a lot of the participatory methods work, right, that we've been already hearing a lot about at this conference. We want to make sure that there is disparity assessment, right? We need to measure bias, and then we need to mitigate it. And we also want to see independent evaluation, right, of these systems. And then finally, we gave some examples of places where this work is already starting to happen. So the EEOC has been doing a lot of work in this area, and in fact, Chair Burrows from the EEOC will be here to talk to us all on Thursday in one of the keynotes. And so we'll be able to hear more about the work they've been doing then. And on the industry side, there's an industry consortium that has gotten together to also try to put in place some of these guardrails. I think I'm going to pass it back to Mark.
So I think we wanted to use most of the time today to really talk about what it means to put this into practice. And so we're going to ask you all to, because we feel very comfortable in it, because it's called a tutorial, putting you into, having you work in groups and come up with sort of how you think you're actually going to do this. But I wanted to just sort of give you examples of how we're thinking about this broadly. So we think this is something that project managers can and should be deploying. We think this is something for policymakers, for parents, for workers, for doctors, patients, healthcare advocates. One of the things that we wanted was concrete recommendations. The others was we just wanted to make sure people felt confident making these claims. We didn't think that everything needs a new technical expert from fact to parachute into the system. It needs a little delta of a little piece of information that might help. What is the current state-of-the-art best practice? What is the way to think about this? I want to give one example of use that I was involved with recently that I found pretty inspirational. So the RAISE group at MIT organizes Day of AI, and they partnered with the Ted Kennedy Center to turn the AI Bill of Rights into potential legislation. And so they took the questions of privacy, non-discrimination, and safety and turned them into questions where the students, and these were middle schoolers and high schoolers, would choose how they wanted to actualize these principles. What are the options for how far they wanted to go in different sectors? So they thought in terms of schools, hospitals, the law enforcement, et cetera. Two things struck me from this experience. One is how comfortable the students were talking in terms of real algorithmic harms without it becoming nihilistic. There's actually a lot of fights that I think happen at, dare I say, the adult level that turned out to be much easier at the middle school level in terms of thinking through what it actually meant to turn this into legislation. The other thing that I really loved about this experience is it turned something that felt complex and unmanageable into something very manageable, that these are actually concrete questions on which we can build laws, and those laws are going to be reflections of values, and the middle school and high school students were very comfortable leaning into those. So, now the tutorial part of the tutorial. Sorrel, do you want to chat? So, we're going to ask you to spend some time with a partner or multiple partners, so make a friend near you. And we really wanted you to take about, let's say, 8 minutes, and then we'll share out, talking through how you can actually put this into use, what your thoughts are for making this blueprint actually something built. So for some of you, that's going to be, well, I know I'm going to put pressure on HUD. I know the Department of Housing and Urban Development is really where I'm going to, there is a fly really circling me. For others of you, that middle school example may be closer to home of something more conceptual. Sometimes it's going to be about sort of where your research agenda is going to go. But we wanted to spend some time actually taking the tutorial part and making this a tutorial. So take some time and find a friend. Do you have more direction?
Well, I was going to say, like, maybe just one friend isn't enough, but they seem comfortable, so.
Yeah.
Are you guys going to walk around? Should we?
Oh, yeah.
I don't think we're going to.
All right. All right. Can you wrap up your conversations? We'll give you 10 more seconds of brilliance. All right. So we wanted to hear from you now that you have figured out how to use this. So folks who want to share what they came up with.
Yeah, just raise your hand if you want to share, and we will pass a mic over to you so that folks listening in online can also be part of the conversation.
We need more time for the discussion. Yeah, I guess my answer is kind of easy because I'm here from the National Center for State Courts. So we are a big nonprofit that's essentially the research and policy and technical assistance hub for the state courts in every state and territory, all 56. And we are essentially trying to do this right now. So we're trying to take this Wild West patchwork of court systems that are all completely different from each other, totally incompatible policies and data governance practices from each other, and we're trying to come in and say, okay, let's articulate a set of ethical principles and standards, and also maybe some requirements. Maybe we're going to tell the state courts what to do, who knows? But we need to come in and create some kind of framework that applies to all these very disparate systems across the country. So my answer for how I'm planning to use this is we're essentially trying to build this kind of a document right now for the state courts. So I'm just going to use this as really good guidance.
That's like the best answer you could possibly hear, so I apologize to whoever's next.
Hi, this is Albert Gahami with City Privacy Officer for the City of San Jose. And we might have cheated a little bit because we talked with y'all a few months back. But from that work and kind of what we've learned, putting out just some key transparency things like a very preliminary algorithmic register that we're starting to pilot, out there so people can understand the algorithms, making sure that our high risk, high impact models, whether it be something around investigations, law enforcement, transportation, stuff like that, that it has a human fallback and not just a human fallback, but also a human review, especially for things that have to do with criminal justice reviews. And then I think the real open question here, and something that I really would love to see as we develop, is explainability. Because I think there's something around this how and why the AI contributes to outcomes that impact you that we think about, right? Like the 100 billion parameter ChatGPT model, right? Getting to the explainability of something like that feels like a constantly moving target as the models get bigger. So I'm not going to say we have any of that figured out, but it's fun stuff that we're trying to.
Thank you. I think I was really, it's cheating to say you were inspired by your old boss's point, but on agnotology, on not accepting some claims that some things are not explainable and pushing back on that from a regulatory perspective. I'm stalling while Sorel walks.
Hi, yeah, my name's Alyssa. I am here, I work in the research division of the IRS, as was mentioned earlier, and we are using this kind of as a North Star for developing our kind of policies, procedures, and recommendations for how to implement trustworthy analytics into our research division. So this has been an incredibly useful document for us. We're at obviously a transformative time in the IRS. Again, just in the research division, but we're trying to kind of lead the way in whatever way we can, and this has been incredibly helpful to help us align our thinking and make it something people want to do. So.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bhargavi. These were really hard to follow because you're actually using them very practically in your settings, but this has been a really interesting document coming from my perspective. I'm currently in the UK doing my PhD there, and I'm also doing a lot of policy engagement with the UK government. And in global policy, it's a little bit hard to like make sense of what each of the different countries and the different actors are doing at this point because there's so much going on. But I think this document's kind of an interesting and useful way of like understanding the rights-based framework and what it can offer. And I think one kind of challenge has been articulating to global actors like this isn't a binding document the way they see it. So they're like, well, what is this actually capable of doing? Is it just a nice idea or is it like something that can be used? So I've been talking a bit about like the way that this has been incorporated by the different agencies as a way of like kind of directing their efforts as being one of the big impact areas. I hope I'm right in saying that. But this has kind of been useful in that sense. And then your examples also make me think that I should be incorporating this in kind of the middle school education, high school education stuff that I'm also involved with. So yeah.
Following on the previous response, I'm also not exactly working in like a high-level position. I'm a PhD student in the EU. So I'm a machine learning engineer, so a very technical person in the background, and I'm interested in building also auditing systems for algorithms. So I think this blueprint, along with, for example, the trustworthy principles of ACM or the EU AI Act, they give a really good guidance of the focus points you should go through, let's say, if you want to build auditing systems and if you want to audit algorithms, what you should look at. So essentially, that's how I would say I would use it.
So I hope we can keep taking these types of comments, but I wanted to also encourage you all to add in how we can all be useful and support each other in this work, right? So, you know, hopefully this conversation can continue after this room. So if, while you're sort of sharing how you're thinking about using this, you also want to make a pitch for how we can all stay connected and be supportive, that would also be great.
Hi, my name's Philip. I'm a fairness and explainability researcher at Upstart, and you had a quote about discrimination HBCUs. That was us, so very relevant. We oftentimes don't have like good expectations from regulators and banks on like how do we measure fairness or explainability. So some kind of universal bill of rights will really help us move in the direction of mutual understanding between everyone.
Hey, Alex Shodashova, who made the COVID announcement earlier. Sorry, this will be better news. So one of the things that Zena and I had talked about is a little bit of how the AI Bill of Rights, as you described, came out of a synthesis of fact and fact-adjacent work, and how now seeing this distillation and the points that you and everyone you worked with wanted to emphasize also gives rise to some new research questions, like elements that need to be better fleshed out so that you can move from principles to actual like practice and guidelines. So one of the questions that I think I have for you and anyone who's involved in making things even more concrete in implementation is, what are the key research or development areas where we just don't really know enough to move beyond principles or like the high level at which things are able to be presented or were able to be presented when you were drafting the document?
That dovetails into what I was going to say. I'm Miranda Bogan. I was most recently working on responsible AI at Meta and have worked on civil rights and machine learning for a while. And so the first question, how did I use this? It was a really helpful document when the law didn't yet say exactly what needed to be done, to highlight a distillation of what the expectations of a variety of stakeholders were for people developing AI in the meantime, even when we didn't have like a hard sort of enforcement hook to kind of motivate teams to work on things that they might not naturally include in their work. But in terms of what's next, I think that implementing the blueprint in a whole variety of contexts is super important, but what I'm most excited about is figuring out what comes next and what gaps and contradictions maybe start manifesting once people try to do this, and then bringing those back to policymakers once they've kind of taken the step of putting this into practice to say, okay, now can you also clarify what happens when the two things that are required are actually contradicting, or that there isn't actually an existing way to perform a certain function. One example is fairness mitigations of you should expect that you shouldn't have discriminatory systems, but there's a big gap in knowledge on how to actually fix issues, especially if the issues are reflecting underlying societal disparities that can't be fixed at a technical level or even changing the parameters of a system. And so how do we create a bigger feedback loop into accomplishing the goals of the document and not just accomplishing the processes that it's recommending?
Hi, my name is Jay Cunningham. I'm a PhD student at the University of Washington. And when I first came across the document, one of the things I was really excited about, much of my work centers in like participatory AI and machine learning research, mostly like in civic engagement, so involving like community like actors inside of research and work. And so for me and my work, when I got into this, I was having these conversations in spaces like this with other researchers, policymakers, but one of the things that I felt was often left out was perspective of people that we want to design for and build for, and trying to turn this narrative into like designing and building with. And so outside of my graduate work, I'm actively involved like in the community with like organizations like ACLU, NAACP, and one thing that I've noticed is like many like local community organizations that advocate for things surrounding social justice and equity, have efforts around education and food insecurity, but technology has been one of the things that's still kind of emerging, mostly because people sometimes think that they might not understand or have like technical backgrounds. And so one thing that really made me excited about this document was that like it laid out so many of the issues that we know that are aware and things that people might experience, but they themselves might not know how to act upon those things. And so I'm excited about the research that comes out of this. I'm excited about the policy, but I'm even more excited about the action that people can take civically, being that like you don't have to be like a researcher or a scientist to actually take a stance for this. And so I'm really passionate about like helping to inform the communities on like how to act on this. And so yeah, anyone wants to have those conversations, feel free to chat. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Sebastian. I'm an attorney at the EEOC. I think our agency was a little upstream from this document, but the process of creating it definitely was something that focused our agency. Just talking in response to Sorel's request for things that could be done, our laws. I mean, we're one of the algorithmic discrimination protection is one of the few things that's actually in the law currently. But what would be useful is translating, creating research that shows metrics that we can use to determine whether something is complying with our laws, because the laws are framed not in the same language as the algorithms. And we'd need to then translate it to judges.
Thank you. And I think that we are at time. Yes, I'm getting the nod. So I wanted to thank you all for this really inspiring set of actions. Encourage you all to keep moving forward with that work, and also really sort of offer. And I'm going to do this without asking Mark, but offer up the two of us as resources. Feel free to email us and let us know what you're doing. And hopefully we can all keep moving that work forward.
Thank you all so much.